So we are the Institute for SuperStorm Education for the public and private sectors. And today we'll be talking to you about hurricanes. So yeah, hurricanes. There are two the most recent hurricanes that have hit the Northeast are Sandy and Irene, and both have had very devastating effects. And this isn't a coincidence. It's because of climate change. Climate change has been affecting the patterns of hurricanes from moving through the southeast part of the United States and change the path to completely bypass or minorly hit the southeast and come up to the northeast part, which is very unprepared for hurricanes, flooding, and all the impacts that hurricanes cause. And so, our worst case scenario begins in New York. New York is what we would like to call a microcosm for a lot of the big cities that span the U.S., not necessarily just the Northeast. And it is a very valuable part of the U.S. economy. It houses the stock market, and also because it is right next to the coast, it has a lot of import-export industries. So in New York, we're expecting a Cat 3 to 4 hurricane, and to make it even worse, there's a Fujiwara effect, which involves two different vortexes combining to create an even massive hurricane that causes even more damage. This will also occur during high tide, so flooding will be massively increased in parts of New York as well. And due to this flooding, a lot of the infrastructure of New York will be damaged. The subway systems will be shut down. All the bridges will be shut down. Highways will be will also be shut down. The utilities, electricity, water, sewage, gas, they will all be shut down for however long this hurricane lasts. And so this will really start to put some pressure on cities like New York, which are very dense and very highly populated. There's also a lack of citizen awareness, which makes New York a very, very detrimental area to be hit by a hurricane. So we need to make sure that people on the Northeast and other parts of the U.S. are very well aware that hurricanes can happen and are starting to move into different areas that have never really experienced a hurricane before. So here is an overview of the populations of New York City. It is home to about 8.2 million people, and there is about 28,000 people per square mile. And if we compare this to New Orleans before Katrina hit, New Orleans had a population of 1.16 million people and about a little over 2,000 per square mile. So if you think about the impact of a hurricane hitting New York, it would be about an 8-fold difference. So that is a lot of damage compared to what we all know and see happened after Katrina. And here's just a count of all of the facilities in New York that could be used to help with the recovery and some of the damage control after a hurricane. There is over 800 elementary to high schools. There are 35 colleges and universities, and around 50 large to small hospitals. And here are the number of firehouses and police precincts. They are scattered all around New York City, and so there's a lot of aid available during the hurricane.
Presuming they're above water.
A lot of them are actually out of the flood zones, but we'll show you the flood zones in New York. But a lot of them are actually out of it as long as they don't line the coast. And then here are the transportation or some of the transportation exposure in New York. there's about 6,000 miles of highways and 38 bridges spanning 21 miles. And remember that bridges will be completely out of commission during a hurricane or a category 3 to 4 hurricane, and even 1 and 2. And damages to these transportation ways will probably total up to $1.5 trillion. And then there are also 3 airports which will also be shut down for a period of time, as well as 3 heliports, 2 seaplane bases. And this is a map of the subway system in New York. As you can see, it spans throughout a lot of New York, and it goes around 232 miles, and there are 468 stations. But as I mentioned, during a hurricane, subway stations are closed down. During the past Hurricane Sandy, it took about 3 days for the officials to completely drain out the sewer system, the subway systems, making it very hard to recover right away. And so here's the flood zones. The different colors indicate the different category of hurricanes. And so, yeah, most of the flood zones line the coastline. But in our worst case scenario, if there's high tide, these flood zones will more than likely start to go a little more inland. Okay, so here are some of the utilities that are exposed to hurricanes. There are 14 wastewater facilities that are, as you can see by the red dots, are very close to coastlines and also in flood zones. So they will be very vulnerable and will most likely acquire a lot of damage. And then here are the electrical power substations. There are 61 substations, and most of them are concentrated in Manhattan because that is the headquarters of the electricity supplier for most of New York City. And here we have the potable water system, where New Yorkers would get potable water. They come from 2 different locations, not in New York City. There's one in Catskill. There's a Catskill, Delaware water supply, and these totals about 6,000 miles of pipelines going into New York. And so, as a total, there will be about $8.2 billion of damage if a hurricane of Category 3 or Category 4 were to hit New York, because the electricity, the water, the subway stations, and everything will be shut down or damaged, and so that would be a huge amount of money to recover from.
So as you heard my colleague say, we have covered a bit over wastewater areas, how transportation will be very difficult in the prior days of a hurricane and obviously during the hurricane. And we have also talked about how bridges will be out. So I'm going to cover those 3 topics now. So on this map here, these are all the different areas that hazardous waste may be a problem. As you've noticed, you really actually can't read any of the city names because there's so many of these symbols. So all of these hazardous waste areas range from spills, storage, and to areas such as manufacturers, etc., that house hazardous waste. So waste spills, waste sites, solid waste facilities, hazardous material facilities. So obviously during a hurricane, some of these places may be damaged. And as my colleague pointed out in the flood zone map, Manhattan will be affected quite badly. And as you can see by the wonderful green, blue, and red dots, it's a terrible wasteland filled with things that will poison everyone in the city. So these things can range from heavy metals to solid waste such as sewage, which is like defecation and wonderful things you don't want in your water or in front of your house that is now underwater as well. So you don't want to be drinking this, you don't want to be eating this, you don't want it on your streets, you don't want it anywhere around you. So because New York City and many of the other places that can be affected by a hurricane will have lots of hazardous waste around them, we need to take precautions with these hazardous waste areas. So our group recommends secondary containment. So in case that primary containment facilities are damaged, you want to make sure that it doesn't immediately spill out. So in New York City, for example, much of their hazardous waste is kept in underground containment areas. However, if these aren't secondarily lined and kept strong under structure and that they won't seep out into the soil around them, we can have some very bad effects on the environment around us. And if this affects agricultural areas, now your food is tainted and topsoil is removed and pollutes everywhere around you. And it's, in general, not a very good situation. So, as I said, this can cause very bad health impacts, but I will be moving on to emergency routing and bridge impact. And as you can see by this little subtitle, bridges will not be useful. So as we saw in Hurricane Katrina, bridges didn't really fare well during the hurricane. This is caused by a few different effects: buffeting, aeroflutter, and resonance frequencies that affect bridges. So people who have taken physics may know that there are different frequencies that affect kind of planar thin in structures that causes them to wobble and overturn and throw everyone on them off into the sea or ground or unfortunate places for life. So bridges can be affected by hurricanes days before they actually hit the city. So we want people off of bridges. We don't want you in the air where you will be pushed off of it and onto the ground. Next. So how are we going to be able to evacuate people or get people help if bridges are out, given that quite a bit of New York City is surrounded by water? For example, Staten Island. Well, New York City has a wonderful ferry service. They have several different categories of ferries that range from small capacity to large capacity, as well as their emergency ferry system, which is funded by, I believe, a $1 million fund, and each boat can carry 12 passengers as well as emergency services. However, we would like to expand this and move it across some of the country so that it doesn't just apply to New York City. And as you can see, these are the different ferry traveling sites that exist right now. They affect Manhattan and a bit of Staten Island. But to be able to ensure that we can give satisfactory aid after a hurricane and to evacuate people before a hurricane, because you don't want to be trapped there during it, we would like to expand these services a little so that it's not just a tourist attraction and that their ferry services aren't just maintained so that people can get back and forth to see the Statue of Liberty.
Okay, so hurricanes are some of the most devastating and expensive disasters that the U.S. has ever encountered. Hurricane Sandy, which happened in 2012, caused 150 deaths, but it swept away 650,000 homes and $70 billion in physical capital, which is a little bit ridiculous. $50 billion of this capital was insured, which means that $25 billion of it was just an uninsured loss of physical capital. This is second in cost only to Katrina, which happened in 2005 and had 1,833 fatalities. The Bush administration originally saw $105 billion, but recent studies show that that number should have been closer to about $150 billion. But more than the physical capital that hurricanes are sweeping away, you also have to consider regional economy, which it just completely destroys because hundreds of thousands of people are being left unemployed, so no paychecks are being cashed, no money is being spent, and no taxes are being collected. So it's not just that it's destroying physical things like homes and neighborhoods, but it's also just rendering the economy completely useless for a certain period of time. And as we can see, Katrina has continuing effects that wasn't just those few days. And it's something we should worry about, considering that New York especially has a 95% chance of a hurricane hitting it in the next 50 years. And that's just New York, and that's not the rest of the Northeast coast. So recovery in terms of displaced persons, especially in New York, Hurricane Sandy displaced 40,000 households, and New York is actually pretty equipped to handle these households. You can see there's 65 shelters that handles displaced people. There's one in each, or there's a couple in each borough, obviously, and each shelter holds 10,000 people. This is an ideal situation, but Hurricane Sandy was housing people in the Superdome at first, but that didn't work out so well. So they moved all these people to vast outdoor stations, which didn't work because of weather and because of looting. So it's a huge problem for current Northeast cities that aren't used to hurricanes. And if something like Florida is moving people to outdoor shelters, places in the Northeast like Vermont and Maine who aren't equipped for hurricanes don't have any shelters in place. We also have this issue of power, which is kind of a problem, because power affects both heat and safety and therefore economy because businesses aren't open or people are unemployed. Just even in a tropical storm, it'll take a couple of days to restore power. We saw in Hurricane Sandy, after 2 weeks after the hurricane, there were still 120,000 people who still had no power. And power, again, isn't just electricity in your home. It's also electricity in businesses and financial districts. So your economy, besides having physical capital, destroyed, this issue of electricity is interesting because it's still affecting your local economy in that it's rendering it pretty useless. Okay, so in terms of recovery, right now New York has $650 million in place for recovery funds, which, if you can remember those numbers I showed you before, the $75 billion they had swept away was obviously not covered by this $650 million. FEMA suggests the reserve fund for any major city should be $500 billion, which seems a little bit optimistic and kind of may occur in a utopia because cities aren't super game right now to have reserve funds because they think disasters don't happen because they're super random and it's not going to happen to them. So in an ideal world, you'd have a $50 billion reserve, but until then, I'm going to show you some mitigation techniques that would be probably more helpful and you can implement now instead of saving for this fund. Okay, so we have 3 different kinds of mitigation techniques. The first is a dual status command structure. When we saw in Hurricane Katrina, National Guard and Red Cross were operating on either a state or a federal level, but not both, which resulted in a whole bunch of communication issues and leadership issues. Things were either being repeated or not said at all. And so in order to resolve this, Hurricane Sandy deployed a dual status command in which you could operate on both the federal and a state level, and therefore communication was fine and leadership was good. And while governors are hesitant to give out this kind of privilege because they feel like it's too much power, it's the thing you have to do if you want to avoid faulty command structures, just because a chain of command in a disaster situation doesn't always exist. We also have this issue of retrofitting. The main problem with the Northeast and getting hit by hurricanes is that none of the buildings are fit to any kind of hurricane code. Florida and Louisiana are all built to different hurricane codes so that at least they can mitigate some of the damage. While Cat 4 hurricane will come through and take away all of your capital, you can still try and retrofit some of your buildings, especially in states like Vermont and Maine, which right now don't have any kind of hurricane building code. And the third, and probably most important that we're looking at, is education, and I think a couple of the other groups touched on this also. Because you need to solve the problem of public complacency. The problem with the Northeast is that 78.5% of that population hasn't experienced a major hurricane, so they have no experience in a hurricane, nor do they think it's a threat. So in order to resolve this, we need to be educating the public on proper evacuation or non-evacuation and safety measures. Less public complacency results in more mitigation measures. If you're more educated about the topic, then generally there's more funding for that topic. If New Orleans had been educated or if the public complacency hadn't been so bad, they may have voted to fund that levee that broke and destroyed a lot of their capital. So education helps ease public complacency, which helps put mitigation measures in place.
Okay, thanks.